Good morning, AP Psych. I wanted to set the table a little bit for the Stanford Prison Study. I know y'all read about it last night for homework, but I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Zimbardo's rationale for setting up that study, and then talk a little bit about the dynamics that were at play that caused that study to end after 6 days. So I want to read to you from Zimbardo's book. It's fantastic. It's called The Lucifer Effect, one of my favorites, but he goes into great detail about why he set this experiment up. So let me read it to you real quick. The rationale, according to Zimbardo, our research will attempt to differentiate between what people bring into a prison situation from what the situation brings out in the people who are there. By pre-selection, our subjects are generally representative of middle-class educated youth. They are a homogeneous group of students who are quite similar to each other in every way. By randomly assigning them to two different roles, we begin with guards and prisoners who are comparable, indeed who are interchangeable. The prisoners are not more violent, hostile, or rebellious than the guards, and the guards aren't power-seeking authoritarians. At this moment, guard and prisoner are alike. So really what he's trying to demonstrate is how the situation can bring out certain behaviors, expectations, perceptions, and that it's really not about the individual, it's about the situation the individual finds him or herself in. In this case, all the subjects in the Stanford Prison Study were young boys. They were of college age. They had responded to an ad in the paper to participate in a study. They knew that this was a study about prison life. They knew it might not be ideal, that the food might not be great, but I don't think any one of those subjects had a sense of what exactly they were getting themselves into and what the impact of the experience was going to be. So first, what I want you to think about, we talked about schemas a lot this school year, schemas being those kind of cognitive organizational units, construct, not literal, but a construct. These schemas are informed by our experiences. So we continue to shape them and they continue to change based on the experiences we've had in our life. So each of us has a schema for guard, for example, or for prisoner. So I want you to think about, I've posted some questions on the discussion board. I want you to think about what comes to mind when you hear the word guard, when you hear the word prisoner. Guards wear uniforms, for example. Prisoners wear jumpsuits, or you might think orange is the new black, or prison tattoos. But these are schemas inform how we respond to someone in a particular role. So for example, if you've, hopefully this hasn't happened to you, but if it has, if you've been pulled over due to a traffic violation, you likely have a response to that police officer based on your schema for authority or guard or officer. Same thing's happening with these boys in the Stanford Prison Study. They're coming into this study, as Zimbardo points out, a homogeneous group at the start. However, they each have their own individual schema at play based on experience about what a guard is supposed to do, how a prisoner is supposed to act. So I want you to think about how those schemas informed how these boys responded given their particular roles. And it's important when you think about the roles, it's important to think of the props that went with them. If you think about a guard, for example, most guards are going to have, like I said earlier, a uniform. They might have a badge. They might have a radio or a gun, a nightstick. These are all the props that inform the role. If you're a prisoner, you might have a jumpsuit. In the case of the Stanford Prison Study, they're in hospital gowns. They have hairnets on, so their hair is if that's an identifying piece, their hair is covered. So they all look alike. All of these things in the Stanford Prison Study were very intentional to set the dynamic at play. Again, I know in the video yesterday I talked about the power of the situation. This is really going to be a primary element to this study, how the situation guided these boys' behaviors. So think about schema. Think about how the schema informed these boys and their behaviors. Unfortunately, we're not in class to really dig deep into this, but Zimbardo set this up intentionally to go ahead and kind of psychologically get the prisoners in the mindset of being a prisoner. He had them arrested at their homes. They were taken to the police station. They were fingerprinted. They had their mugshots taken. all of the things to psychologically set these boys set in motion the mindset for these boys that they were in fact prisoners. He, of course, transformed the basement of Jordan Hall, which is where the psych department is at Stanford, had it transformed to a prisoner. The guards were already there. They had undergone a training the day before. When I say training, there really wasn't much they were told except that they could not hurt the prisoners. They couldn't harm them. And that was really it. So the guards are going to come up with their own list of rules and regulations. And again, these are boys. These are college age kids. But they're going to come up with their own rules. They're going to set what they believe should be the norms for this particular social situation. And, you know, the prisoners are going to get there. And really, it's not going to take long for the roles to take over, for any kind of reality testing that these boys might have is going to go out the window, because they truly believe themselves to be guards if they're a guard, and the prisoners truly believe themselves to be prisoners. The objective reality, of course, being that this is a study. This was an experiment. They were boys who could at any moment leave the study, but they chose not to. That's an important thing to consider. Why didn't they leave? They could have. What was going on there? Another thing I want you to think about, you know, as you were reading the study, you're probably thinking, what in the world was going on? Think about the role of conformity. You know, the prisoners all conformed to what each other was doing. Think about the guards. They conformed to what each other was doing, even though you had a continuum of behaviors, with some guards being much more extreme, being aggressive, being condescending, being kind of gross, frankly, to these prisoners. And then you had other guards who just kind of went along with it, even though they knew it was wrong. Same thing with the prisoners. You know, they could have, well, in fact, they did at one point kind of plan a prison rebellion. It didn't work. Someone ratted them out, and boy, the consequences were great for that. So think about the role of conformity. Two major themes we need to consider when thinking about the Stanford Prison Study. First is de-individuation, and the second is dehumanization. De-individuation, like the name suggests, is when you lose your identity. You lose your sense of self. I know we gave the example in class one day of Halloween, how petty crimes escalate on Halloween because people's faces are covered by their masks and they feel more emboldened to engage in a behavior that they wouldn't do typically if they didn't have the mask on, or if they weren't in a group, for example. So de-individuation, you lose your sense of self. If you are a subject in the Stanford Prison Study and you are a guard, you put on your uniform, you put on your glasses, you have your badge, you have your nightstick, all of these things allowing you to become the role of guard and lose your sense of self, you lose your sense of individuality or identity. If you're a prisoner, they put them in hospital gowns, they had little I can't remember what, like not ankle bracelets, but little things to mimic like a ball and chain on their ankles. They had hairnets. The guards came up with the rules that the prisoners could not be called by their names. They would only be called by their numbers. And the guards would be called Mr. Correctional Officer. So there too, both ways, they're losing their sense of identity. The prisoners are just simply a number, and the guards are simply a correction officer. When you lose that sense of identity, you also lose that sense of responsibility for your behaviors. So think of de-individuation. If I lose my sense of self, it's really easy, frankly, for me to blame the role instead of taking ownership of my behavior. The second dynamic to consider is that of dehumanization, that loss of humanity. We see that as the guards continuously treat the prisoners as if they're not human. The first thing they do is they delouse the prisoners when they arrive at the prison. Now, they weren't really delousing them, they were just shaking powder on them. But again, psychologically, it's going to reinforce this idea of, if I'm a guard, that I'm in control, I've got the power. And if I'm a prisoner, I'm a prisoner. I have no power. And more to the point, I'm being treated as less than a human. So I'm deloused. I am made to scrub toilets with toothbrushes. I am treated like worse than a dog, which again, psychologically is going to have a negative impact on the prisoners. This thing is going to go south very, very quickly. You're going to see the types of emotional breakdowns that one would associate with some sort of acute onset mental illness. And certainly the guards are just walking around with swagger, man. They love it. They've got the power. The really interesting thing is where Zimbardo falls on this. He's the chief researcher. He's watching during the day through, a double-sided mirror, and he's watching video. At night, there was no one there, and no oversight provided at all, which of course means that all the really kind of pathological behaviors are going to escalate at night. But Zimbardo, as the lead researcher, should have been thinking about his ethics. I want you to think about that too. When you read this, I hope that your ethics alarm was going off, because Zimbardo is going to be harpooned for the lack of ethical oversight that he provided. And in fact, this book, The Lucifer Effect, is very much his mea culpa for what happened in those 6 days. He appoints himself as the superintendent of the prison, and he too starts strutting around with a little swagger, calling this my prison as opposed to my study. And that's kind of the greatest irony, is here's a very, very intelligent psychologist who's conducting a research study on the effects of the situation and the power of the situation and the power of roles, and he himself succumbs to the role of prison superintendent. In fact, it's his girlfriend at the time, who later became his wife, who called him on it. It was like, dude, you're being a jerk. You are talking about this as your prison as opposed to it being your study, and you've lost control and you've lost oversight, and these poor boys are being tormented as a result. And so he calls it after 6 days. So, this study certainly should be a warning to all of us about how situational forces can override what we know to be the case. This was a study, but in the boys' minds, whether you're a guard or a prisoner, or if you're at Zimbardo, it became a prison, and the roles and the power of the situation, the social forces like conformity, really, really led to just the breakdown of the social norms. One more thing I want you to think about is something called pluralistic ignorance. We as humans, we like order. We're learning that now with all of the coronavirus adjustments we're having to make. We like order, we like consistency, we like predictability. When we don't know how to behave in a certain situation because the norms are unclear to us, it's novel meaning new in this context. A novel situation really makes us feel very uncomfortable. So we look around to others for guidance on how to behave. That's called pluralistic ignorance. And this was very much at play with these guards and these prisoners, none of whom had ever been a prisoner before or a guard before. They're thrust into this setting with these props, these roles, these expectations, and they don't know what to do. So they look to one another. So pluralistic ignorance and conformity are kind of a peanut butter and jelly relationship. If I am in a novel situation, I don't know what the norms are, I'm going to look around to see how everyone else is acting, and then I'm going to conform to that behavior. That's also going to protect my role or my assimilation into the group, because we know we don't like to feel isolated. Nobody likes to be kicked off the island. So many situational forces at play with this study. I'm so sorry we can't be together to really unpack it, because it's one of my favorites. Truly, it is so fascinating to see how after 6 days, how these norms broke down. And then, of course, with Abu Ghraib in 2003, it was like a replica. Zimbardo was going to freak out. Like, man, we haven't learned a thing. Look at what happened to me in 1971, and the American government and certainly the forces in that prison in Baghdad certainly replicated it almost to a T. It's quite frightening. If we had more time together, of course, we would unpack the Abu Ghraib prison study as well, but we're not going to do that. We are going to read the Stanford Prison Study. I hope you enjoyed that journal, and certainly email me or call me, text me if you have any questions about it. There's some videos also on the class page titled Arrests, Counts, and Prisoner 8612. I do hope you'll watch those, because it does give you some insight through the archival footage of what these boys experienced, and then you can make up your mind about whether or not this was a dispositional situation or a situational situation. In other words, are we okay to say that these guys were all jerks, or do we really need to consider the social context? My hope is that after reading the Stanford Prison Study, you're going to say clearly, Mrs. Rouse, it is the social context that's going to define our behaviors, and that we would be